Let's introduce ourselves. I'm Peter, and this is my wife, Margaret, who, incidentally, never forgets anything. Believe it or not, when we turn the corner of the street, we shall be in Milan. Almost, anyway. Of course, our route and travel plans had been carefully worked out weeks beforehand, and this was in the nature of a test, really. A test of our Lambretta and of ourselves. So, farewell London, and welcome Milan. We were determined to have a wonderful holiday this year, and why not? It was Margaret's first visit to Italy, and we'd been by Innocenti, the engineering company who produce Lambrettas, to visit their factory in Milan and take back to the National Lambretta Rally at Oxford a message of good from the Lambretta Club of Italy. So out we drove, through the city, out to the suburbs of Milan. This, for everyone who owns a Lambretta, must surely be quite an occasion. It was for us, I know. We were shown how the parts are sent to the assembly line, how each individual engine is tested before being put into the frame, how careful inspection rejects any parts not conforming to the high standards that Innocenti set, and how every scooter undergoes a thorough road test before passing out of the factory. In these vast works, nothing is left to chance, and only the best is good enough for the Lambretta owner. And yet they turn out a complete scooter every 40 seconds. After leaving the factory, we had some time to kill, so we rode back to the center of the city for a little sightseeing of our own. The first place we visited was naturally the cathedral. It took them from 1386 to 1890 to build this beautiful cathedral of 1,000 spires. But measure for measure, 504 years to create so perfect a thing is no time at all. Entertainment is everywhere. If not buildings, then it's people. How much? Well, it's too much anyway. To the station. Admittedly, it's no longer Europe's most modern railway terminal. Vienna's Westbahnhof and the newly completed mainline stations at Munich or Rome are now more beautiful to look at. It's true, but this was certainly one of Mussolini's better moments, and it's well worth visiting. But you can waste an awful lot of time in a city that's new to you, unless you know where to go. We had the president of the Lambretta Club of Italy, Signor Villarese, the well-known racing driver, as our host and guide for our short stay. But first, a magnificent lunch here at the Lambretta Club of Milan. It was the sort of occasion we wanted to spend 2 hours over. We were lucky. We did. Rather than plan our tour over a map and a guidebook, Signor Villarese took us onto the roof of the club after lunch and pointed out the landmarks of the city. Way below, and looking very insignificant, was the Arch of Peace. But close to, a 75-foot high monument is really quite imposing. We were told it was originally built to celebrate Napoleon's victories. In the end, it commemorated the peace of 1815, which was, quite literally of course, Napoleon's Waterloo. What I did regret was that we were not able to spend more time with Milan's La Scala Opera House. Every seat was sold, so we only heard muffled sounds, which is no more than Leonardo hears, and he's always around. But there are other things to take his attention. Milan moves quickly. Tempo is in their blood, both the old and the young. We ran across what we thought was a Grand Prix training school. We watched this little display for several minutes, and I'm not so sure that these children don't know most of the answers already. Margaret, I must say, was very taken with them. That is, until one of them drove over her feet. What a wonderful day it had been. But now, home through the dusk to put our feet up at last. We had one more thing to look forward to before we left Milan. Once again, they rolled out the red carpet for us. We'd expected somehow that they would slip the message of goodwill in our pockets as we waved them goodbye. But Italian hospitality wouldn't allow anything as offhand as that. Not that the occasion was by any means formal. It was all much too good fun for that. But it was an occasion, and the Italians are famous for living up to occasions. So, this was it. This was the beginning of our long journey back to Oxford, and farewell to our hosts. This is certainly the way to do it. Whether you're in Milan, Paris, London, or any city, the only way to cope with the traffic is by Lambretta. Yes, it certainly is the only way. The smell of wet earth, the crops in the nearby fields, the wind and sun in your face. It was such an exciting feeling leaving the city and starting our run to Stresa and the Alps. We were reminded to fill up with petrol for the day's journey ahead of us by seeing the familiar BP sign just outside Milan. We were surprised to find we could buy our favorite BP Zoom anywhere on the continent. They don't seem to reserve this kind of special service for the Alfa Romeos either. At these stations, they maintain the driver of a scooter has every right to first-class attention that the owner of the fast car has. But what a cheerful crowd they are. We thought they'd be surprised when we told them we were traveling all the way to London under our own steam. But to them, long-distance Lambretta drivers are as plentiful as mountains in the Alps. We really enjoyed the roads in Italy, and particularly the autostrada. There seem to be little M1s all over the place, and they certainly help you to cover the miles at a good average speed. Stresa is a beautiful centre for exploring, stretching as it does along the shore of Lake Maggiore. I had to promise Margaret we'd make for Stresa next year and sail over to the 3 romantic little islands nearby. But then I had to promise Margaret we'd come back to stay in practically every place we passed. So far, the next 38 summer holidays are spoken for. I actually caught myself noting several places I shall return to. 1 or 2 of them I've even put reserve tags on to retire to. It's a funny thing, but quite a high proportion of them are just there, almost out of sight, between the mountains. But then, it's always that way. On the way to the border, the sky got darker and darker, and Margaret was nervous about the impending storm. But we couldn't stop at this stage. We decided to ride it out to Lausanne. In a few minutes, we would be in Switzerland. Customs and passport formalities are the only things to indicate you are leaving one country and entering another. It's difficult to believe that by crossing a white line painted across a roadway, You were entering an entirely different country, where they speak another language, and the politics and the food are as different again. As we left the customs, the storm looked really menacing. And although there were shafts of sunlight, we agreed that the weather was certainly better on the way out. After a while, it was pouring hard, and the pass road was slippery. But the Lambretta stood up to it well, and we hardly had to slacken speed for the rest of the journey to Brig. The change that gives Switzerland its character is very much tied up with the mountains themselves. It is strange what differences there are between the various regions. In the south, everything is rugged and grey. Towards the north, it becomes much more fertile and lush. We had to push on quickly from Brig. Our journey took us through St. Leonard and on to Sion. Sion is the chief town of this largely French-speaking canton, the Valais. We counted 3 beautiful old castles as we drove through, and we couldn't help thinking this was an unnecessary precaution against attack. The Valais must have been the least accessible part of Switzerland, containing the greatest number of high peaks in the country. The villages have been so cut off from one another that even we noticed the inhabitants spoke with quite distinct accents at each place we stopped. Margaret adores asparagus. Unwisely, I hurried through Martigny, which is famous for it. So now, 1963 is reserved as our great asparagus year. But our destination for the night was Lausanne, and it was already late enough. From the window of our hotel, we looked out over Lake Geneva, all 314 square miles of it. Our start the next day was again an early one, and the morning was misty and fresh. The countryside between Lausanne and France, through the Jura mountains that lead gently down to the plains of Burgundy, begins to be less rugged, more luxurious. Here are the vineyards, the farmlands that send their produce back twice a week to Lausanne. This is the sort of country you can take your time exploring on a Lambretta. We decided to stop at Pontarlier for lunch, and found the people at our hotel genuinely anxious to please. We even found time to look round this charming, attractive town, before Margaret reminded me we ought to be moving off, as Paris was still 24 hours away. But right now, our next stopping point was the main town of the Jura district, Besançon, center of the watch industry. It was here I saw a beautiful handmade watch I couldn't afford. Or rather, I could, but the thought of customs duty put me off. This photographer insisted on taking our picture. But outside a church near Besançon, we came across a happy group, well, almost happy anyway, which needed a photographer far more than we did. There were no photographers, not much ceremony, and rather sadly, not many friends to send them off. We still had a long drive ahead of us to Troyes, but being Margaret, and being a wedding, this was obviously not the time to hurry. So we stayed until they'd gone. In point of fact, it was no problem making up the time. We filled up with petrol at Bar-sur-Aube and set off for Troyes, where we were to stay the night. So this is the Seine, all very peaceful, making its age-old journey to Paris. Before we left Paris next day, we thought we might see the city in its early morning mood, a time when most tourists are sleeping off the effects of the night before. The restaurants are silent, and the streets take on the character we all expect in those nostalgic Parisian songs. The traffic, we decided to leave, and so we took the route to Abbeville. Town after town flashed by, the Lambretta taking it in her stride like the seasoned campaigner that she is. At Abbeville, we were very surprised to see the wonderfully modern shops and offices. I'd read somewhere that a short while after the D-Day landings, during the Normandy campaign, it had been reduced to a pile of rubble. It was obvious that this rubble was not allowed to lie very long after the liberation. And so to Le Touquet. And after the smell of bacon and eggs welcomed us to a familiar breakfast, we kicked ourselves for not packing our bathing costumes. But we hadn't realized that this part of the French coast has such beautiful beaches. But we amused ourselves by watching the experts giving a lesson in gymnastics, and later popped off to the casino for a little flutter. On the journey out, I must admit we'd both been a little apprehensive about flying our Lambretta across the Channel. We'd imagined all sorts of customs difficulties and loading delays. It could scarcely have run smoother, though, and the journey back was the same. Mind you, even the Silver City organization can't vouch for its passengers arriving on time. Home again. It's hard to believe that we've traveled over 1,500 miles since we left a week ago. We couldn't have looked the smuggling sort at Lyd, and I suppose with our quota of duty-free cigarettes and one message of goodwill in Italian, we weren't, because customs hurried us through before you could say, "Well, I declare." So off we went on the last lap of our journey to Oxford. As you can see, others had the same idea too, but with our date to keep and so many people waiting for us at the rally, we couldn't stay and be sociable. Perhaps not quite an autostrada, but it was good to be back on the left-hand side of the road again. As a finish to our wonderful holiday, the rally was certainly no anticlimax. Lambretta rallies always have a gay continental atmosphere. With our message of goodwill, we entered the gates to the rally to find a reception committee of over 2,000 Lambretta owners waiting to greet us. It's difficult to describe our feelings as we drove at the head of Lambrettas from every possible corner of Great Britain into the main arena. We were welcomed by Mr. A.J. Agg, President of the British Lambretta Owners Association, who then read to the assembled crowd the scroll which we had brought all the way back from Milan. Margaret and I listened with mixed emotions. We were proud to have been chosen to represent so many people, and yet a little sad that they had not shared our wonderful experiences during the last few days. Still, who knows? Next year? As is always the case at the Lambretta rally, we met dozens of old friends who were all anxious to hear about our holiday. We told them as much as we could in the time, but one thing is certain, and they all agree. The Lambretta slogan is true. Get around better. Travel Lambretta. And you really can.